Welcome everybody to tonight's webinar. I'm not sure what part of the country you're in, but where I am here in Virginia, it is hot, 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 and it has been hot, 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 and we haven't had a lot of rain either. So this is certainly something. My son actually is in soccer camp, and yesterday was the second day in a row that a child had heat stress and had to go to the hospital. So heat stress is a real thing right now for horses, pets, people. So I figured this would be a timely webinar. So first of all, what are the signs of heat stress? Um, and I actually was talking to another group the other day saying a lot of these signs aren't just in horses, they transfer to other animals as well. You know, my cattle, your dog, your cat, they can have similar symptoms, people. So breathing rate is higher than the heart rate, or faster than 60 breaths per minute. So the horse is really panting, and we'll get to it later on, but panting or breathing heavily is the secondary way that a horse cools itself. It's not the primary way that it cools itself. So if that is having to take over because the primary way of cooling themselves, evaporative cooling, isn't working, it's just not going to be that efficient. Reduce feed or water intake. Now, reduce feed intake, I know we all kind of decrease our food intake when we're hot or miserable, but you cannot decrease the water intake. So if your horse does go off their water, you need to make sure that you're doing things to encourage water intake. Rectal temperature above 103. And again, we'll talk about that a little bit more at length. It's kind of above 103 and for a prolonged period. Increased heart rate. So what that means is when they're hot, they're trying to pump their blood around their body to cool it down. It's pumping it to the extremities and trying to cool it down. And their heart will start pumping faster to keep moving that blood so that we can cool it down. Profuse sweating, or worst case scenario, they stop sweating. When they stop sweating, the primary way that they cool themselves down, which is evaporative cooling, stops, and we're in big trouble. Droopy ears. We all know horses typically have ears that stand up. So if they get a bit droopy, we know that that is a pretty bad sign. Even in my cows, I mean, cows' ears don't stand up, but you can tell when my cows are sick, their ears are, I would describe them to the vet as droopy. Restless, lethargic, depressed demeanor. Dehydration. Now, there's a couple of ways that we can determine dehydration, either the skin pinch test on their neck, which we'll go into a bit more later on, or the capillary refill time, which is when you lift up their top lip and you press your thumb on their gum and how fast the blood comes back after you take your thumb away. Muscle cramping and colic, other signs of heat stress. So the actual heat produced by thoroughbred racehorses during racing can rapidly elevate the core body temperature. Whether it's thoroughbred racing, whether it's barrel racing, when you're doing exercise at speed in heat, metabolically, that just from the actual exercise, not even just the surrounds, but the actual exercise, we call that metabolic heat production, that's going to create a lot of core body temperature. When it's hot and humid outside, their normal physiological cooling mechanism, which is that evaporative cooling, becomes very ineffective. Horses are at higher risk of heat stress if they are poorly conditioned. So let's say that you're exercising your horse more than they have the kind of exercise tolerance for. You're over exercising them. Overweight, when they got a lot of extra fat. Older horses decrease their ability to regulate their temperature. Horses that are unable to find shade or don't have shade provided in poorly ventilated stalls or trailers. Trailers can be really, really hot. Heavily muscled horses as well, because they're just creating a lot of thermo heat anyway. And those that are not acclimated to warmer temperatures. So usually I would say those horses coming from the north going to the south, but over this last week, I feel like you could have left Virginia and gone to Texas for cooler weather. But typically we know that going south to compete, those horses may not be acclimated to those hot temperatures. So we know that a horse dissipates excess heat by putting all their blood to the skin, and so the blood is close to the surface. so that when they sweat and the air hits that sweat and evaporates it, that is going to cool that area and cool the blood that's right under the surface. Sweating eliminates about 70% of the heat generated by exercise. Breathing rapidly or panting is about 15%. Decrease is eliminating up to about 15%. So that's when I say, if the horse really is over exaggerating that panting, it means the sweating is not functioning very well and they're trying to take over with the breathing rapidly, and it's just not that effective. So I always say that you need to know what is normal for your horse. We give guidelines: normal rectal temperature, normal pulse, normal amount of water that a horse should drink, normal respiration rate. But what is normal for your horse, right? Um, and so typically we know that normal for a horse at rest is less than 100 degrees Fahrenheit. During normal exercise, anywhere from 101 to 103. So earlier I said 103 and you could have some heat stress. It's not that your horse hit 103 and then cooled themselves down and went back to less than 100. It's 103 and it stayed that way. It was prolonged at that temperature. And then above 106, we are in trouble, right? This is full on heat stroke, and we are going to have some really negative effects happen to that horse that can actually even be death. So, what I recommend is if your horse gets to 103, so you're exercising, that less than 100 is normal, that in the hundreds to 103 is normal for exercise. When you finish exercise, take your temperature, and you want to make sure that 3 hours later your horse still isn't 103. So I always recommend that you know what your horse's temperature is, resting temperature, you know what their exercising temperature is, and you know what is normal, a normal amount of time. Maybe it's 30 minutes, maybe it's an hour for them to decrease that exercising temperature back to resting temperature. And if it's taking too long, you need to call your vet sooner rather than later and just let them know, hey, I think my horse might have heat stroke. I'm monitoring, I'm doing these things so that if they need to come, it wasn't like, just out of the blue I called and said, hey, my horse is really on death's door, I need you to come immediately. And they're like, oh, sorry, I'm the only one on call tonight and I've got another emergency. So just giving people a heads up that you may need help. I think this is a really handy chart that everybody should print out and have in a barn, because it's not just about the temperature. I said that evaporative cooling is the primary way that a horse gets rid of heat. Well, evaporative cooling means that the air on the outside of the horse can take on the moisture that's on the horse, and in doing that, it evaporates it off the horse and cools the horse down. Well, if the outside air is so humid that it can't take on any more water, then we're not going to have that evaporative cooling, right? So it's a combination of temperature and humidity combined that gives you this number that we call the horse heat index, and that's the number we really need to be focused on. So, for example, 130 combined number of temperature and humidity, low risk, can do all the things. 131 to 150, that's medium risk. You need to make sure you're taking breaks and you're actively cooling your horse down at the end. 151 to 180 of temperature and relative humidity combined, light work only. And then if you're greater than 180, don't exercise at all. So let's say medium risk. So if we take 140, and I'm just doing some calculations here. So let's say it's 70 degrees out. Most people would ride in 70 degrees, right? But what if it's 70% humidity too? It's really, really humid. It's going to rain. Then those two numbers combined is 140, and that may not actually be a great time for you to ride your horse, especially if they're older and don't dissipate heat very well. So it can be cooler, but if it's, very humid, that's hard for the horse. I know when it's humid out, I feel like I'm breathing water. But, I know we all joke and say, "Oh, Texas, it's the heat is easier to bear when it's not super humid." I mean, some places in Texas are super humid, but, I know growing up in Australia, people would say, "Oh, it's a dry heat. You'll be fine." Yeah, well, I know a dry heat in the oven still cooks a turkey, but a dry heat actually can be safer because that dry air is going to evaporatively cool that horse. So temperatures might be 90, 95, but if it's very dry air, we could be safe. So if you have an overheated horse, okay, we've determined this horse is overheated. What do we do? Immediately move them to the shade. Increase the airflow over the horse. So we're increasing that evaporative cooling. Make sure they're drinking fresh water. Give an electrolyte or put an I have it here because if you know your horse drinks well, then you can put some salt in the water. But typically, I recommend giving them an electrolyte into a syringe into their mouth so we know that they're getting it. And if by chance it altered the flavor of the water, it wouldn't decrease water intake. So I said increase airflow, spray the neck, head, rump, where all the big muscles are, right? That's where all the heat is, that's where all the blood flow is. And so we want to use ice packs over the jugular because that is the blood that's pumping around. Call your veterinarian when your horse's temperature stays above 130. Wait, 103, sorry. Don't wait too long. Continue to monitor the horse over the next few days. And this is very interesting. We know that when the horse has gone through a kind of any kind of stressful event, that after the fact we need to monitor them, especially for development of colic and laminitis. So this has been flowed. This is probably the biggest myth when it comes to cooling a horse down. That you have to scrape a horse. Scraping is actually not recommended. When you want to, and the analogy I have is put a fan on in your bathroom, like a fan that's going to blow on you, not a vent fan, and get out of the shower and stand in front of the fan all wet. You're going to be freezing. Dry off, you might still be chilly, but you're not going to be freezing, right? So the myths are, oh, well, if you put a wet horse in the sun, the water will not evaporate and it'll boil them. And no, the water evaporates the same as sweat and cools the skin. Even when it's 100% humidity, the wet horse will cool better than a dry one. Water is a better conductor of heat than air. So wetting the horse and leaving it wet for a while um, is great, right? Now, I know that a lot of people will scrape horses because, well, I'm going to put them back in their stall and I don't want them to get covered in shavings. For 30 minutes, let them stand in the tack in the wash stall and cool off, maybe with a fan on them. But then you can scrape them and put them away. But if you're really trying to cool a horse down, don't scrape them. One of the ingredients that we utilize in our supplements is called chromium, right? And it's a trace mineral. You need it in very small amounts, but it has some pretty impressive functions in the body. Um, Obviously, like a lot of minerals, the organic form is the most bioavailable. Research has been going on in chromium since the late 90s. Um, oops, it's water soluble. It improves glucose utilization. You've heard me talk about chromium when we talk about athletic performance or metabolic syndrome in horses. The product that we use is the first of its kind in the market. It's got 20 years of research, 50 peer-reviewed research studies. It is the only FDA-approved chromium for use in horses in America. It's called Chemtrace Chromium. And along with a whole slew of other things that we've talked about in the past, chromium actually can improve an animal's state when they are stressed. So stress in an animal releases cortisol. The release of cortisol or corticosterone alters how nutrients are utilized by the animal, and especially in a horse that is a flight animal, not a fight animal, right? They need to run away. So when a horse is stressed and they release cortisol, it says to the body, take nutrients away from everything else you're doing and put the nutrients into the areas that are going to allow me to flee. And that is not what we want, right? So we know that chromium can kind of interfere with that cortisol release and decrease the impacts of stress. This is looking at heat stress. Actually was looking at heat stress in pigs, but we know that pigs and horses have very similar thermoregulation. And we're looking at rectal temperature. Rectal temperature, the solid bars are controls, and the dotted lines are when they've been given chromium. So you can see the rectal temperature in the solid bars, that's the heat stress control. And then so the yellow bar, yellow at the bottom, that's thermoneutral. You didn't give them any kind of heat stress, right? They've just stayed in a nice cool environment. And you can see, we'll start with the yellow because it's the easiest to describe. It doesn't matter whether they were eating chromium or not eating chromium. If you don't stress them with heat, you see rectal temperature stays the same. But if you stress them by changing the temperature and making it really hot outside, then you can see the animals that did not get chromium had a higher rectal temperature. See, that solid orange line is much higher than the dotted orange line, right? And then if we look at respiration rate, same thing. If you don't stress the horse with high temperatures, doesn't matter whether they're eating chromium or not, the respiration rate is the same. But if you heat the area up, if you put them in a hot environment, and then you look at the respiration rate, you can see the animals that did not get the chromium, that's the solid orange line, that's the control, their respiration rate or breaths per minute was significantly higher than those animals getting chromium. So chromium actually really helps dissipate that stress, get rid of that cortisol's negative impact so that the animal can shunt more nutrients to getting rid of that stress versus being able to run away. The chromium is in the racing formula, the e-boost paste, and the metabolic. So you can use the metabolic, you can use e-boost. If you're feeding the racing formula, any one of these will give you the recommended amount of chromium per day. If you aren't using one of these products and you're like, okay, well, I'm using DAC Orange, I'm using an electrolyte supplement, I'm using the DDA, which one would I recommend adding? Adding the metabolic is probably the easiest to just add every day. So a horse will typically drink between 5 and 15 gallons a day, but they could drink up to 30 gallons a day if it's really hot and they've exercised a lot. But again, you need to know what is normal amount of drinking for your horse, and not what is normal for horses in general, but what is normal for your horse. We know that feeding hay will actually stimulate thirst, and hay also acts as water holding capacity in the hindgut. So if you want to stimulate your horse to drink, make sure that you're feeding them plenty of good quality fiber. When it comes to salt, this is a common question that I get. I always recommend plain white iodized salt. Loose salt is better than a salt block, but unless you have a fancy feeder and then you put the loose salt out in the field with no cover on it, then it rains, it just turns into salt water. So the harder blocks are more weather resistant. But it's really quite impressive how much um, weight a horse will lose after exercise. You know, if you do an endurance race, 50-mile endurance race, your horse could lose 10 to 40 pounds just in sweat losses. Ranch work, 10 to 40 pounds. Thoroughbred racing, because thoroughbred racing is much shorter amount of duration, they lose less weight. But we all know thoroughbred race horses typically don't have any weight to lose. And then obviously we've talked about the signs of dehydration and then what is normal body temperature, heart rate, respiration rate. I mentioned the capillary refill time and the skin pinch test. So if you press your thumb on the horse's gum and then you take it away and the color returns within 2 seconds, your horse is fine. If it takes 3 seconds or long, like 1,000, 2, 1,000, 3, 1,000, and the color still hasn't come back, you know that the horse is dehydrated. And then the skin pinch test, again, if you hold the skin up in a tent and then when you let it go, it takes more than 2 to 4 seconds for it to go back. You know that your horse is dehydrated and that fluid is lacking in the skin surface. Electrolytes. Electrolytes, the purpose of sweating, we've said sweating decreases the core temperature. 70% of the horse's heat is dissipated by sweating and evaporative cooling. The major electrolytes in sweat are sodium, chloride, potassium, calcium, and magnesium. They're the most common. Muscle cramps, uncoordination, impaired nerve and brain function. Now, it's harder to see impaired brain function in a horse, but they might get a little bit more frazzled. But in a person that had heat stress and had low electrolytes, they will become dizzy, a little forgetful, not remembering things. That would be signs of heat stroke. Sodium and chloride, that's plain white salt, major electrolyte. Salt. So what you'll see also with these electrolytes is there is an electrical charge, like positive or negative. And that is because these electrolytes all send electrical impulses to either open the cell, close the cell, cause muscle reaction, you know, decrease muscle reaction. So that electrical charge is quite important. Um, Sodium and chloride, it is found in much higher concentrations outside the cell, so in the blood and other fluids surrounding the cells, than in the cell. If you've ever tasted blood, you know that it's kind of salty. But the kidneys are also primarily filtering the blood, and they control the saltiness of the blood. So if the blood is really, really salty, and so immediately when you're testing a person with heat stroke, they'll test your blood and look at the saltiness of the blood. And if it's really, really, really salty, you know, the kidneys are breaking down and not functioning, and we need to fix that. Potassium. This is inside the cells, right? And one of its major roles is to the sensitivity of nerves and muscles, not overreactive, not underreactive. It's in skeletal muscle and in the heart muscle. So we know with those horses HYPP, right? Now that's nothing to do with temperature, but those horses with HYPP, they can't tolerate potassium because the function of potassium is busted, right? And so that's why they will have muscle nerve twitching because potassium is not able to do its job of regulating those nerve impulses. Calcium, we think of calcium a lot of times when we think about bones and teeth, but it is also really important as an electrolyte for muscle and nerve tissue. Magnesium, magnesium, it's the hot topic. You know, everybody wants to feed magnesium, and really, it's this last statement down here. Magnesium is required for normal muscle function, especially for the relaxation of a muscle. And so someone reads that and says, oh, well, my horse is a little hyper, so I should feed it magnesium. It'll calm it down. And my horse must be deficient in magnesium, and that's why it's crazy. It's actually really rare for a horse to be deficient in magnesium. They get magnesium from plenty of sources in the diet. But we do know if you do supplement with large quantities of magnesium, it can have a sedative effect. It can also have a kind of uh, diarrheal effect. It can really cause diarrhea in animals and people if you take too much magnesium. So again, some more statistics on the loss of body weight after exercise. So when we're the timing of electrolytes before, during, and after. So If you're doing endurance riding, people will do it all through the race. But I think about on the trailer the day before, on the trailer that morning of, let's say you're, whether you're barrel racing or doing Western pleasure or dressage or jumping or whatever, throughout the day, once in the daytime, you're going to give them some electrolyte, and then after exercise, you'll give them electrolyte. Sodium and chloride should be the primary ingredients, like salt, not sugar, right? Because if it's got a lot of sugar in it, that's going to actually bind the uptake of those electrolyte salts. DAC electrolyte has no sugar in it. I think that a lot of people forget to supplement with electrolytes during the winter time, even when they're exercising their horses frequently, because they don't see them sweat. But we know that the air temperature is very dry in the wintertime, so they're just evaporating it very quickly. So don't forget, anytime you're exercising your horses heavily, you need to be feeding an electrolyte. Oh gosh, I don't know what's happening with my mouse here. We talked about older horses, less fit, dark colored, unclipped, sick, large, overweight horses will struggle more with the heat. If you don't train in the heat of the day, your horse will not cope as well competing in the heat of the day. Horses lose around 7 to 10 pounds per hour. Traveling is tiring. Don't leave horses standing in trucks or trailers all day. Competition, you know, you've got to be reasonable with your expectations of performance if it's really, really hot. Allow horses to drink all the time. Horses should have 24-hour access to water. The white rugs, actually, the white cotton, that is more breathable and actually will reflect some of the heat off them. There's been some studies looking at that. So we've got the electrolyte paste, the electrolyte powder. I recommend using the paste daily, and the powder daily, and then perhaps when you're on the trailer, you take some electrolyte paste, or at the show, some paste, especially if your horse has a tendency to go off feed when you go to a show. But the other thing I think we forget about a lot is microbial fermentation, like the breaking down of fiber in the horse's gut actually produces a lot of heat. So in the hot weather, we want to make sure that we're feeding really digestible fiber sources and utilizing things like DDA, because that's going to help break down fiber, and taking away some of the really non-digestible fiber sources, or increasing the amount of fat, because the digestion of fat does not cause heat. So these are kind of some other supplements on the side that you don't really think about when you're thinking about treating horses with heat stroke, or recommending feeding programs for hot weather. But the DDA actually can be very helpful in decreasing fermentation heat, and the oil as well. So any questions? Kind of zoomed through that one because I wanted you to be able to ask some questions, but um, I'll unmute and see what happens. I'll turn the recording off.